Hello and welcome to the 11th episode of the Testing Peers podcast. This podcast has kindly been sponsored by Saffron QA. Saffron QA is a provider of recruitment and consultancy services exclusively for the software testing industry. More details of Saffron QA can be found in the show notes. Today I'm joined again by Chris, Russell and Simon. In today's episode, we're talking about telephone interviews, our experiences of them, both as interviewers and interviewees, and whether they have any place in the future in this post-COVID world.
I have actually got a topic that we can talk about that relates directly to the episode. Are you excited?
Riveted.
We're always
riveted.
excited.
So, this is a fun time.
Is this banter or is this actual topic?
This is legit banter. It's going to be podcast gold. This is the value add stuff that David talks about, none of this fitting in. I had the distinct pleasure of selling telephones for a while when I was in university. Telephones therefore became a bit of an obsession, sort of in the time before everything became a bit sort of Android or iOS, and that's your spit and everything's a block of a phone that you can't really tell what it is. I'm holding up a phone, podcast gold. So, my question is, what is the most interesting phone you ever owned? And was there ever a really cool phone that you wish you had owned that you never either were able to get it or you just missed the boat and you went for the Nokia brick or something? I love phones.
Well, I remember getting the 8210 or 8230 or something, which was
the
like the
really little
Nokia
one.
tiny little one.
Mm.
And I was really, really happy with that because it was tiny. It was easy to kind of take this was when I was a student. So it was really convenient, but it was quite expensive at the time. Nothing like iPhone expensive.
But the age you were at, I mean, that's...
Yeah, as a student without money. And I thought that was really cool because before then I had quite a big, beefy Motorola. So it was a completely opposite phone.
But was there a phone that you had really wanted to get that you never actually made to get?
No.
So you always got the phone you wanted?
I remember my first phone was the BT Cellnet thing. I can't remember what it was.
The Philips Savvy.
I had that, and then that was handed down to me, so that was my first phone. I never had that for very long. And then there was this bright yellow Siemens thing that I decided I wanted to get as my first phone that I decided myself, I'm going to go and get that one. And I wanted it for the colour, and it was also sort of padded and foamed around, so it was droppable and didn't break. And then I went to the traditional 3210. But I personalised it. I was a big Austin Powers fan at that point, so I had the Austin Powers theme tune as my ringtone. I had the Union Jack case on it. I had anything I could do Austin Powers was on the phone. And then I went on to contract and got the Motorola flip phone, and that was when I started getting half-decent phones. But I never really had a phone that I was desperate to get. It was all a case of pick the colour or pick something that was interesting. I always want the latest phone, but I never need it, so I never get it.
I've always seen mobile phones as functional items, so I didn't actually get a phone until 2000, probably, was my first phone just before I got married. And yeah, it was just a Nokia.
But you've got an iPhone now. Did you really want the iPhone, or was that just like...
Well, everyone else in the family was on an iPhone, and just because...
So you don't get the obsession?
No. Other people in my family love Apple stuff. They've got an iMac and things like that. I still see my phone as functional.
Apple, if you're listening, we do like free merchandise of Apple phones and other Apple equipment. I have to say, I am completely in the Apple ecosystem now. I mean, I've got Apple Music, it's got all my music on. All photos are in the iCloud. It's just everything's in.
There's a spot on your wrist where you haven't quite fulfilled your Apple. So Apple Watch, Apple, if you're listening. For me, the phone that I think I loved the most, so not the best phone as far as what I can do with it, but the one that when I got it, I just thought, this is a thing of beauty. I like to think of it. It was my first Xiaomi Mi Mix phone. Now, not a very well-known phone, but it was just at the advent of phones getting a notch. The whole little black bit that pops down at the bit with hosting the camera so you can fit more screen in. And I just thought, I don't really like that. And there was a video that I saw on YouTube of this insane phone that claimed to have no bezels, and I thought, that's exciting. And I got to the point where I actually imported it from China so I could actually have it. It was massive. It had 256 gig of storage. It had all the high-end things. But I was kind of obsessed with it. When I was younger, there was, not that much younger, like 10 years ago or something, Samsung released a phone that was also a projector. It was the Samsung Galaxy Beam. So the whole point was, if you had something that you could stream on your phone, it had a bit on the top of it, and you could just point it at the wall and watch it. Well, was magnificent.
Didn't catch on there, did it?
Didn't, and do you know why? The projector wasn't bad at all. The problem was that in order to fit that sort of hardware within the phone and keep it at a low-end cost, which was probably a mistake, was the reduced capacity on the phone, be it memory or storage or the chipsets that were in use. And so it was laggy, it was not up to date even when it was released. While the beam bit was successful, the user experience was atrocious. Isn't that a shame?
And from phones, we'll go on to telephone interviews.
Oh, that was smooth, David. Well, I didn't even notice it coming. So, anyway, has anyone ever had a telephone interview? Ever? What are your thoughts? Let's deep dive. Dun, 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 dun. Who thinks they are super awesome? Who thinks they're important? Who thinks they're terrible? Who thinks they're awful? Who has got good experiences? Who's got bad experiences? What's the longest one you've ever had? Has anyone ever had any difficulties? Let's go. Telephone interview.
It's just a quiz show tonight, isn't
It is. So telephone interviews. All the questions. Can you repeat those so I can write them down? So,
my experience of telephone interviews,
and we're not doing video interviews, just telephone.
All right. Keep your hair on.
Easy for you to say.
Telephone interviews. I've found in the past the best way to get value out of telephone interviews is to ensure I've got a standard set of questions that I go into them with. I don't necessarily ask every single question I have written down to every person I interview, but I have a standard 2 sides of A4 that I print off and I can write on them as I'm talking to them. So I've got a simple way of screening so that I can basically screen every candidate the same way. And you obviously still get the ones that can talk freely and there's more things to talk about, and you therefore end up asking them less questions off the sheet because you don't need to try and elicit that conversation. It's just kind of flowing naturally. And there's the other ones that you need to ask more of the questions off the sheet because the conversation's not flowing, but you might still be interested in them. I think the thing for me with telephone interviews is it's very easy to end the call early if you don't think it's going well, although it isn't necessarily always the best practice to give them 10 minutes to go, yeah, actually, I've had enough now. I don't want to talk anymore. It's kind of finding that right point that you can say, okay, I think I've got enough now, and leave the call there. I've been on telephone interviews that have gone on for an hour. I've been on some that have gone for 10 minutes. It doesn't necessarily always mean the short ones are the ones that I don't end up hiring. It's just that in that scenario, I've got enough in those 10 minutes to make a decision.
I would agree. I think I have a similar set of questions. However, it depends on the level that you're actually, or the experience of the candidate that you're actually doing. So therefore, for a more junior role that's only just come out of university, then they haven't got the experience. So therefore, you're trying to find more about them as a person, as to what makes them tick and what skills they have that will add to your group. Whereas obviously the more experienced person, they have more depth on their CV. So in that scenario, I'd more likely ask them about what details they have in the job, that are relevant to what we have at our company. It's also finding out what those people are. They aren't just a CV. It's actually getting to know them. We've covered in the CV episode, you need to get through the door. As soon as you get into the telephone interview, you are a person, or they are a person, and it's getting to know them to see how they tick, to see how they talk about their subject and the topics that you talk about, and see if there is an actual rapport and they have a personality.
We're obviously talking about right now when we've been the ones interviewing over the telephone, and that's cool. So have you got any prerequisites for what you are looking for in a telephone interview in order to get to the stage where you will actually want to see their faces?
I don't know about prerequisites as such. I will just base it on, have I been able to have a conversation? Has the communication been effective between the two of us? I don't know whether I'd have any particular things I'm looking for. Yeah, I'm not really one for buzzwords when it comes to them saying the right thing. It's more about how they've said what they've said, how they've articulated, how we've communicated, how the interaction's been. At that stage, I'm not looking for deep down technical detail. I'm not looking for lots of experience stories. I'm looking for key snippets that give me an insight into, okay, I want to find out more about you. I want to dive deeper, and I want to be able to elicit that information out of them. I think one story I've spoken about before at the different stage of interviews, and the person I ended up hiring was a junior person I hired for my team in Ireland when I was at McAfee. It was his telephone interview that I really triggered me, that I wanted to take it further, because he came on very nervous and very shy. But within 2 or 3 questions, just because we got the conversation going, he really opened up. And I noticed that difference in the confidence level. And that was enough for me to realise he's human. He's not got the experience because it's a graduate position. I'm willing to take a shot here. And it was actually that encouraged me to bring him in for face-to-face. And from there on, he got the job. Sometimes it's the telephone interviews that you get enough out of the conversation that you can make a decision there and then before you actually meet them. And it gives you an initial idea of what the person's like, at least in my experience anyway.
I think also at the end of a telephone interview, for me, it's also how many questions do I still have about the person? What questions did I feel that they were lacking information or lacking confidence? It's the minimal number of worries means that I'm interested in them and want to do them more. And I think that one good example of when I was interviewing, we were looking for a more technical person, and he didn't say that he had any languages that he learned. And so I was questioning whether to actually make a telephone interview for them. And just as the off chance, he mentioned that he had started doing some Python training. We then went down a route that I didn't expect to happen. And yeah, it all went very well from that particular point. Things can come out surprisingly well in telephone interviews that may be missing on CVs.
I don't know about anyone else's experience. I feel like I've given a lot of telephone interviews, but when I've been interviewed for roles, I've had the initial phone screening from the recruiter and it's been straight into a face-to-face. I've never had that telephone interview process when interviewing for jobs, but yet when I've been hiring, I've always done a telephone interview first before we do the face-to-face. So it's just, I don't know, I think it's something I've done quite a lot of from the hiring perspective, but not to be hired perspective.
I've done a bit of both. I've worked with recruiters that have done that screening, as you just mentioned, Simon, and I've also done the screening myself. I think the word screening is probably quite a good one, really. I don't like the word, but it kind of sums it up quite well, because you're trying to understand why they're looking, what they're looking for, trying to understand a little bit about their personality and what they are as a person. We can go into David's quote around, cultural fit, etc., but we're not.
It's spreading, David. That quote's getting everywhere.
Let's get it right. Culture add, not culture fit.
Culture add, not culture fit, exactly. And then the communication. Where I've worked most recently, you're talking on Zoom, you're talking on digital channels quite heavily. So if you can't converse clearly and accurately over a telephone, that's a useful thing to learn and to find out quickly, because you won't be able to work within the environment we were working in. Once I built the rapport up with the recruiters and they knew what we were looking for in those areas, we were able to kind of delegate that responsibility to kind of the recruiters in our world. It is just a high level filter sifting through those sort of areas. And someone not interested in the job, oh yeah, it was a job, I applied for it. That turns me off a little bit to start with. If someone's kind of confrontational, angry, shouty, won't let anyone else speak, etc., that turns me off a little bit. And then if someone asks you to repeat yourself 10 times, you can't understand, that again turns me off a little bit further. So it's all about measuring those three things up. Just sense check anything odd on the CV or anything you want to ask. Save yourself time, like languages. My one often is agile. When you say you've done Scrum, what do you mean? I think it's often the one I go to. So yeah, so it's about trying to do those things. Certainly from giving these sort of telephone interviews, then I think it's useful to get the context, to get an understanding of the candidate without huge investments of time. Coming to an interview is stressful. Preparing for a face-to-face interview is stressful. Telephone interviews are usually little time to prepare between. Nothing we're going to probe you on, just trying to fact find. So I think they're very good at that initial high level, quick get to speak to the person versus read.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think there's definitely the screening aspect of asking the questions that you need to find out the bits about. There's obviously the things like location, and maybe not so much of an issue nowadays, but when I was doing lots of these, it was always a case of how close to the office are you, how easy is it for you to commute, etc., etc. Then there's the obvious things about salary expectations that if the recruiter's not done it already, then you can ask that question as well. And then one thing I would always do afterwards is, especially for the ones that I wanted to take to the next stage, I would go away and write a paragraph about what was discussed so that I had a backing of my decision as to why I thought they should go to the next stage, so that I could hand that to people before the interview. If it was a panel interview, I'd have a description of this is what we discussed in the phone interview. So we didn't really have to go over it again. Maybe there's points from that we can take and go dive deeper, but then there was other parts that we wouldn't need to cover again because I'd covered it in the phone interview. Gave people a bit of context about the person before they walk into the room, which sometimes helped make the interview more natural.
Yeah, it's definitely good to share notes and keep high-level notes. No one likes saying the same things twice.
The legal requirement as well.
Yeah, I always find interesting what the legal requirements are, because no one's ever given me training into the legal requirements of interviews.
Yeah, that's true. That's the first time I'd heard that.
But yeah, I was told you need to make sure you ask the same questions to the candidates. You need to keep it as consistent as possible, and you need to make sure the notes are kept. And again, for data protection, depending upon whether the candidate was successful and unsuccessful for different periods of time, and they need to be obviously locked away, stored digitally in safe, secure locations, and all that jazz.
One thing I was going to pick up on that you said, Russell, is about communication. I think that's vitally important depending on what role it is. If they're just coming in to sit at a desk, then the personality doesn't need to be there. But if they're actually client facing or more senior level, so they're talking to PMs or other people in the company, then that becomes much more important. And if they can't get technical ideas across in simplified ways or gauge the audience that people are talking to, again, that's something that can cause problems, whether you actually want to bring them in or not.
There are a lot of people that struggle with telephone calls in general, especially in sort of the modern day world where people don't really use the telephone for anything ever. That does change the game a little bit. From when I was first interviewing for jobs versus now, people don't use phones, people don't have landlines, and mobile problems can be a thing as far as like how easy is it for the person to take a phone call at a certain time, like availability, like in a lunch break where you're trying to be subtle. I know some people named David Maynard used to take phone calls for interviews in their car during lunchtime breaks.
That was a long time ago.
Anything to escape Chris.
Yeah.
He could tell when I wanted an interview because I was the one who said, I'm driving that day. It's not your week. No, I'm driving.
There's a lot of considerations and stresses that come around phone calls for some people. Like they legitimately don't even want to take a phone call. And so one of the challenges is people who are doing these calls, as with any interview, is actually putting the people at ease and framing it in a position where I'm not judging you explicitly on these things. I'm judging you on just how we grow in this conversation. And like David says, have I got more interest in you after the conversation? Are there more things I want to talk to you about this role? Like, it might not just hobbies and stuff. I've had very long phone interviews as an interviewer and as an interviewee. The interviewee ones have been more just because I talk a lot, whereas the interviewer ones, it might surprise you, I didn't do a lot of talking. It's still, if I'm left wanting more, that is enough for me to want to go to a next stage. I didn't ever go into them with a cheat sheet or stuff like Simon said he had, but I always knew I had a picture of what we were after. You can tell if people are not very keen, even if you can't see their faces, they're not very keen on telephone. We've talked about passions in a previous wonderful episode very recently. And one of those things that you're trying to look for is people who can't see them light up, but you can feel people's voices light up when they're talking about something that not only they're comfortable with, but they know a lot about and they have interest in. That's the bits we need to be able to grab onto. And actually only having our ears to pick up on these things is so much harder. And so the environment in which we're taking these interviews, like David hiding in his car for these sorts of things, it is actually important that it is quiet space, not only for us, but if they can get into a quiet space themselves as well.
Yeah, I'd agree. And I think sometimes location of where they're taking the call can sometimes have an impact on the quality of the discussion. I've certainly been on calls where even though we've told them what time we're phoning, they've been standing on the side of a busy street somewhere, or they've been on a train, or they've been somewhere. It's either they forgot the interview was coming, or they just couldn't find somewhere quiet to have the call, and you try your best to have the discussion. And sometimes that doesn't work necessarily in their favour, that they weren't able to find a quiet place. Equally, there's the situation where they do find somewhere quiet. Like you say, they're not very good on the phone, or they talk very quietly, and it makes it very difficult to understand what they're saying, and you feel like you're really trying to get the information out of them. And I think if you get to a point where it's very difficult to get any conversation out of them, that's a sign that it's not a very successful call. The person may be very capable of doing the job, but for me, regardless of the level they are, the job is for, there needs to be that level of communication, that level of conversation that flows naturally. And if it doesn't flow naturally, that for me is a turn off.
Yeah, agreed. You just reminded me something there, which is the kind of planning of these things. Telephone interview itself is the end result, but how you communicate, when's it going to be, how you are flexible with them. Some cultures and things, you tell them a time, they take it as gospel. Some you want to ideally work with them to find a time that works for both parties. Being flexible with those times helps resolve some of those problems of they're on the commute or, they're doing it in their car at lunch break. If you can be flexible as a leader, then that can actually help get better times. But also making sure when these things are arranged, there's an expectation set. This is just to get to know you. We're not going to ask you any detailed questions. Again, it saves the candidate having a bigger stressful experience. It means they know what they need to prep or not. You're going to ask questions on the CV. You're going to just get an understanding of what they're looking for in a job currently. Those sort of setting the scene things up front before the actual call actually happens. And then if not before the call, at the start of the call, I think help make the experience for the candidates themselves better, lower stress, much more relaxing. And I've been on the other end of that where I've basically been told, congratulations, your interview's at this time. And I felt that's a bit blunt and rude. And I come from a culture where I would push back on that. But it's interesting to see how it actually does feel being on the receiving end of some of these sort of lack of information, or someone tells you, oh, yes, I'll have a telephone interview with you in 3 weeks' time. Just things like that feel weird and odd.
At our company, we approach the candidate as to when they are available, usually in the following week, and then build the interview as part of that. And then as part of that process, also tell them who are going to be interviewing them. So already they've started that communication, and often we get a view from that particular company on LinkedIn and stuff. And you've had people that have watched or read blogs or wherever that we've written and stuff. So already they come and start that interaction. If they do that, then that's quite a good thing. It's a thumbs up.
Yeah, I think the other thing you say about asking them what times suit them, I think something that I've noticed a lot more recently that's starting to play in is when people want to interview you, they will send you a link to a calendar site or something where they've got slots saved for interviews, and you select the ones that suit you best. And then they obviously then, once you've selected one, that then gets confirmed as the time that you're having your interview. So you've had an active play in which time suits you and suits them before you have the interview. So then you know when to expect it. You can immediately gets plugged to your calendar as well, and then it's all synced up, which helps. You have to be as accommodating as possible. At the end of the day, they're interviewing you as much as you're interviewing them. So you've got to give them a good feeling for the company, so they want to actually take it further, if they're good enough, but they decide, actually, no, I don't want to work for you. Yeah, you've got to make it look attractive.
You just hit a very good point, which I've forgotten to mention, which is about selling your company to them. A lot of part of this initial telephone call is explaining things to them, giving them that time to ask questions which were not in the job advert, which was generic.
Yeah.
To explain the role itself, to give them more context, to let them know if they want it or not. That's a very valuable thing to do very fast by having a telephone interview versus coming all the way into an office, which could be in a different city or location.
Do you ever feel like, as a candidate, have you ever felt a bit disappointed that you've had to go through a telephone interview first before a face-to-face? Or do you think, it's just part of the process? Like, what are your expectations as a candidate going into a telephone interview when you know it isn't just an HR screening? Because I feel like it's quite a different expectation, and I don't know how to gauge it, because I found sometimes I've been on a call with a panel of people that I obviously cannot see, or sometimes it has been on one-on-one, and my expectations were probably kind of so vague because my experiences have been to the literally like, hey, let's just have a getting to know you sort of thing, to really granular questions where I've been asked to explain every single point of the V model in a phone interview.
I think sometimes it's good to have that clarity of what the process is. And I think my experience more recently is that people are articulating exactly what the full interview process is. So you know straight away where you are, at what stage, etc., etc. I think if there's not a distinguishable difference between the phone interview and the face-to-face as far as who's interviewing you, what their purpose is, then yeah, I would feel uneasy about why are we having this phone interview if it's the same people that are going to do the face-to-face in 2 weeks' time or a week's time. It doesn't sit as well as if it's just a one-to-one with the hiring manager for a screening, and then it'll be a panel interview for the face-to-face or some kind of other activity for the face-to-face. I've had states where there's been an extra step added to the interview process because a senior manager wanted to vet every person as well and give me their opinion. Not that there necessarily would be the final opinion, but then obviously if you didn't back them on what they went with, it then adds a little bit of, well, you should have gone for the candidate I said about or whatever else. And it's just,
Gives them a get out of jail free, doesn't it? It puts the blame on you.
It's a bit of a red flag. Surely it's a red flag though. Like if the hiring manager isn't trusted.
Absolutely. For a candidate, you then feel like the hiring manager is not respected enough, or they're undermined by the senior leadership. So therefore, any decision the manager makes, it will be undermined by the senior manager, or whatever the structure is. Yeah, absolutely, a red flag for a candidate.
Yeah.
But for the hiring manager in that situation,
candidate,
you want to prove yourself that you're going to be a good line manager to that candidate, and you're being undermined. So there's an internal issue you need to resolve there.
It's interesting though, isn't it? There can be many steps. It's also the time between them, the information, how informed you're kept. Because I think Chris's point there about kind of don't know what to expect from a telephone interview. The range of a telephone interview is not one thing. It can mean different things. We seem pretty similar in what we're expecting, which is not always the case. And I think candidates should be very clear. They should ask if in doubt. You're a tester. Questioning things is a good sign. I take that as a compliment if someone asks me questions about what's going to happen. I don't take the opposite. I take that as a first sign that if this person's in doubt or not sure, they will actually seek clarity. They will try and find information to help them to do a better job. And an interview is a job in a sense. It's a task that you've got to complete. If you want to start working for them, as you said, you've got to jump through the hoops or through the gates to get it there. So, asking questions to help you make the easiest path is the first hurdle in my head. So, you should definitely ask questions if in doubt. And if you don't get the time you want, ask. And if they're not accommodating for you, it sets a precedent for that company. The company won't adapt to, say, do something at 6 o'clock. How accommodating is this company going to be for you in general? So, everything that happens both ways tells you something about the company.
You can sometimes gauge the culture of a company based on the interview process, and especially sometimes the phone interview. And like you say, the company that won't bend and flex to give you a 6 o'clock telephone interview will probably be the company that will expect you to work till 9 to 10 o'clock at night some evenings if there's things that need to go out the door. Yeah, so sometimes it's the if they're not flexing on you, will they allow you to flex on them in the scenario where they're suddenly mandated you need to work till 9 o'clock that evening because there's something that needs to be done. And the flip side, if they are very accommodating in the interview, are they going to be someone that looks after you when you're in the building?
It's a competitive market. You want the best candidates. The best candidates go quickly. So you need to move fast. You need to be flexible. You need to be what you would want to be if you were being interviewed. Someone who's adaptive, someone who listens, and so on. One thing I was going to say about telephone that is, I think, something that I've remembered and I've not been great at in the past is timekeeping. When you're on the receiving end of it, someone calling you 5 minutes late, that 5 minutes between when they were meant to be having a call and having the call is quite stressful. It doesn't help the candidate experience. It doesn't give you better answers. It kind of makes the whole experience worse. And it's only a few minutes. It doesn't seem like much. But if you're sat there waiting for a call, your nerves are not good during that period of time. Have they got the right number? Will they call me? Have they changed their minds? The things that go through your head aren't that positive. And one thing I can say is, having not done any interviews for a long period and doing some recently, I've definitely become much more aware of my not so good accuracy with timekeeping being a bad thing to do during interview.
I agree. In companies, sometimes people can be a bit blasé at turning up at meetings a couple of minutes late, whereas actually we are representing our company and we should be punctual as being respectful for the candidate itself for exactly those reasons, Russell. It doesn't give a good impression and it sets the candidate immediately to be more anxious about the actual interview.
On the flip side of that, though, if you're punctual on time as the employer that's phoning the person, but you phone them and they don't answer, and then they phone back a couple of minutes later, how does that make you feel?
Equally not a good sign.
or ringing someone and them going, I wasn't expecting a call from you.
It's a lot to do with timekeeping and respect, isn't there? And I think it works both ways with all of these sorts of things. And if you can't make it, then communicating that you can't make it either way is the only way to do these sorts of things in a sort of professional manner. So maybe if we tie this up, we kind of think telephone interviews are probably dead, but it's been a good conversation, and maybe we'll talk more about video conferencing ones at a later date.
Thank you very much for listening to this episode of the Testing Peers. If you have experiences you wish to share with us of telephone interviews, both as an interviewer or interviewee, then don't hesitate to get in touch, either via Twitter @TestingPeers, search for Testing Peers on LinkedIn and comment on our post there, or email us at contactus@testingpeers.com. If you wish to support us, we have a Patreon site at patreon.com/testingpeers, where you can find details of the different tiers of funding available. Again, I'd like to thank our sponsor, Saffron QA. If you wish to find out more about them, again, it's in the show notes. Thanks again for listening. We look forward to speaking to you soon. For now, it's goodbye from the Testing Peers.
Goodbye.